I will mute everyone, or everyone will be muted by me or somebody else. And if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. And yeah, enjoy the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So thank you all for being here today. I'm very excited to talk to you all. As Adam said, I started out with Litzinger a while back in 2016-17. I was working in the Ozarks, and it was my first time in Missouri, and I thought, oh, Missouri Botanical Garden, that's not that far away. Let's see how I can get involved. And Eddie and Susan and Leslie and everyone were so great and friendly and welcoming, and everyone else. And so I got to come up on weekends and help with Litzinger while I was doing that. And now I'm at UMSL in my 4th year of my PhD right now. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I've been doing all these 4 years. So specifically, I want you all to get a few things from today's talk. So the first thing is just that main topic of seed dispersal by ants. I want to talk about the ins and outs of it. There's one main story that you kind of hear about it, but there is a lot of variation, and I want to touch on that variation. And since I know a lot of you are nature enthusiasts and will probably be eager to get to see some of this on your own at some point, I'll show you some of the plants that you could find pretty easily at Litzinger or elsewhere locally, and how you might then take that into as you're interacting with kids eventually, or your own relatives, or just on your own, how you might see then this interaction happen. And then within all of that, I want to show you then some actual results from my fieldwork. And particularly part of that involves fire. But let's just start with the basics. Ant-mediated seed dispersal. What is it and how does it work? So to start with that, I'm going to show you my favorite example, and this is also the plant that I work most with. This is bloodroot. Many of you have probably seen it blooming around as of late. It's just about wrapping up blooming at this point in the area. But it's one of these lovely little spring blooming herbs. It's in the poppy family. If you're wondering about the name, you can maybe see a little speck of orangish reddish sap here from when I broke off a fruit. And basically any part of the plant that you break, it will start oozing this kind of bloody sap. It's not really bloody. It's more yellowish, honestly. But that's where the name's coming from. And if you haven't seen this, or if you just want to see it on site next time you are on site, I'll have a few maps I pulled from my naturalists that Adam and James and everyone else who's been adding to my naturalists, so you can actually see where on Litzinger you could go to see it. But you all do have some patches kind of in the Northwoods, just out of the prairie, if you want to go see that in person next time you're on site. But since the flowering's stopped and now fruits are developing, we're getting to the point where we're about to see what happens when those fruits release their seeds. And so inside of these fruits, they have these beautiful little orangey, golden reddish seeds. And all these seeds have this white, fleshy, gooey thing on them. And this is called an elaiosome. This is your typical adaptation for ant-mediated seed dispersal. And so basically any plant that you see that's dispersed by ants as its main dispersal mechanism or secondary dispersal is going to have some sort of elaiosome where this gooey thing. It's mainly a mix of fats and some proteins and carbohydrates. And so it's typically emitting some chemical signature that is very attractive to the ants. And not only is it attractive, they can actually then feed it to their larvae. So what you see happen is can see this ant. She's carrying the seed by its elizome, and she's going to bring it back to her nest, to her family members eventually, and they can use that to feed their growing larvae. And so that's the typical kind of overview of ant-mediated seed dispersal. If you want a fancy term for that, you can call it Myrmecochory. If you were at James Traeger's talk last year, that Myrmeco, that's where the ant part is coming from. And then the chory part that's where the seed dispersal part is coming from. And this Myrmecochory, it occurs all over the world. Anywhere that you find ants and you find plants, there are some plants probably that are dispersed by ants. And so this map is shaded based on how many ant dispersed plants are in that region. And I want to point out a couple things here. The darkest, the black here, these are all areas of the world where there are basically, they're considered hotspots of Myrmecochory. There are a whole bunch of ant-mediated seed dispersal events happening in these areas. And we are in this little chunk right here. So here in Missouri, we have a lot of ant dispersed plants, enough to count us as part of this whole Eastern North America hotspot. And just to give you a sense of how widespread and potentially variable then this interaction is, in the tree of life, particularly when you're looking at flowering plants, angiosperms, there have been over 100, it's estimated 147 different times that this formula of having a seed that has something that the ant is attracted to and takes and uses to disperse the seed. This has evolved this many times, over nearly 150 times. And we have at least 11,000 species that are exhibiting this, probably more. So since it's so widespread and it's almost inevitable, you would think that there is a lot of variation that can happen in this relationship. And indeed, there is. So let's start with the ant side of things. Because if this is this relationship, why would the ants want to take these seeds aside from being attracted to the elizomes? Are they getting anything out of this? And so from the little work that has been done looking at the ant side of things, there's been a lot more work on the plant benefits, honestly. But what we know is that it seems like most of these elizomes are used as food for the ant colonies. But it's no more or less beneficial overall than any other food source that those ants would be eating. But that can still have a benefit in the sense because if elizomes are variable at times of the year when other ant food sources are not available, that could help then overcome some of this potential famine that might otherwise be happening for the ants. So elizomes can be ant food sources. If we look at this a little bit more in depth, though, I'm going to bring our attention to one particular study that compared the seeds of these 4 plant species that you see pictured here. And they fed these different seeds to colonies of Aphaenogastra rudis, an ant that we know disperses seeds and eats elizomes. And they found that the species of plant had a big effect on what actually happened to the colony of the ant. And so when the ants were given bloodroot seeds, the young, the offspring, the larvae actually grew bigger. There were more of them when eating bloodroot compared to anything else or compared to control chemically formulated diet. But another plant, this big white trillium, this one actually caused more mortality to the workers. So that's actually a negative effect then on the ant colony. So the plant species actually has an effect on the ant. And so some are more or less beneficial to the ants, therefore. And of course, that's just one ant species. There are actually many ants can participate in this mutualism, but depending on what ant species you're looking at, that's going to have different extents to which they're being involved. And so this is some work from a few years back that I did with the help of Lauren Jenkins here. And so I've put a representative of each of these ant genera and sized the image roughly to be the size of the ant. So just so you can see a little bit of how size is also potentially playing a role. But what Lauren and I did is we placed out note cards with piles of bloodroot seeds, and we watched them. And we noted what ants were doing with those seeds while we were watching them. And so sometimes the ants would come up to the seeds, wherever you see this yellow, and they would use their antennae to kind of sense out. So antennae can pick up chemical signatures, but also can just like tactily feel things. And so the ants were finding the seeds in these cases, but then not doing anything more. Maybe they weren't interested. Maybe they just decided it wasn't worth whatever effort it might take to try and deal more with that elizum seed. Wherever it's this lighter green color, this is called mandibulation. So they use just their mouth parts, their mandibles, to maybe pick up the elizum, maybe nod a little bit, maybe even take off chunks of the elizum, but they didn't do anything more. They didn't move the seed itself. But where you see this dark green, so this biggest bar here, this is where the ants actually dispersed the seeds, where they actually picked it up and moved it off the card, at least 5 centimeters. And so you can see a few different things here. Different ants, especially some of our smaller ones, kind of intuitively aren't able to move the seeds, but still might encounter them and still might be interested in them and even chew at them a little bit. But then some of these bigger ants are actually dispersing seeds and are doing that the biggest proportion of the time that they're encountering the seeds. And of all of these different genera, this one in particular, Aphenogaster, where that Aphenogaster root is from the previous slide, is generally, it's thought of as the keystone disperser for seeds in North America because it's so likely to disperse seeds when it finds them, and compared to other ant species, it's the one that you're going to be seeing dispersing more seeds than others. So already you can see then that the ant species is also affecting what's happening to the seed, just as the plant species is affecting what's happening to the ant. But let's look a little bit more at all the ways in which this could actually affect the seed and the plant. And so whenever we talk about seed dispersal for any plant, distance is one consideration, because the farther away you get from your parent plant, potentially you're getting released from competition, and also just that's helping potentially find new inhabitable sites. And so this is trying to be a visualization of what I have found for dispersal distances. And so the amount of seeds that you're seeing here are just showing how often we're finding seeds being dispersed these different distances. And this is in meters. So I'll give you how that translates to feet. And so most of what we're seeing is occurring below 1 meter or a little less than 3 feet. So it's not super far for us, but it could still potentially, for these small plants, it could still have an important impact for them. And then, although a lot of our dispersal events by ants aren't happening at very large distances, there is this kind of tail end where there are seeds that are traveling farther, maybe up to 2 meters, about 6.5 feet. Even 26-ish feet. This one seed out here is representing, we found a carpenter ant that took a seed 56 feet, over 17 meters. So that is starting to be then kind of larger distances, which might also then have big effects for how these plants actually do end up moving across the landscape. And so if you look at what other people have found for dispersal distances and ant-mediated seed dispersal, particularly in our region, because so many of the ant-dispersed plants we have are small, those dispersal distances actually do have an impact. And you'll see things like more degraded forests, where potentially those Myrmecochory populations, those ant-dispersed seed populations, have been killed off for logging or whatever other reason. It takes a lot longer for ant-dispersed plants to get back into those areas compared to wind-dispersed plants, or even ones that larger animals can transport. But distance is also just one part, one component of dispersal. So another thing to consider is, where are the seeds actually ending up? Not just how far, but specific location. And so when ants are taking them to their nests, you can see this ant, she's pulling the seed down into this little hole in the soil. And in fact, about 60% of the nests, a little less, a little more, depending on where I am, but of the seeds that I followed have been going into nests in the soil. So they're therefore being buried for some amount of time. And just that soil tends to be a good place for seeds to end up in. But that's also not the only place where ants nest. So we also get ants nesting in wood, whether that's little twigs or larger dead logs. If you open this up, if I peeled off this piece of bark, this is what was inside the ant brood, and you can see a little seed there as well. So it might be harder for a seed to break through this particular area if it stays in there. But sometimes we do see, I'm sure you've probably seen seedlings coming out of cracks in logs, or even seedlings coming out of little holes in trees by the tomes. So a lot of these places are areas that ants do like to nest. They're moist, they're protected. And as long as the seed has a little place to get purchased, it can be also a good place for the seed to germinate and grow. With that being said, not all ant-dispersed seeds are going to make it into the ant's nest. And so here, the seed, one ant, this Myrmecochory here, is trying to pull it into the nest, but she's struggling a little bit. The hole isn't quite large enough. And so we end up seeing eventually this other larger ant is going to come in and swoop the seed up and steal it away. And so that seed might make it to the nest of this bigger ant, but it might not. Sometimes the ants drop it. Sometimes they end up being attacked by a spider or something else. And the seed just gets dropped in the melee. And then other times, seeds will actually go into the nest, especially with that Asarum rudis, the one that's responsible for so much of the seed dispersal in our area. That species is known to actually take the seed back out of the nest once they've used the elisoms. And so the seed is getting back onto the soil surface, but potentially is still close to the nest. And so some of this research looking at them, what's happening to these seeds after they're leaving the nest again, has shown that there is a higher microbial activity, higher enzyme activity in the areas where the seeds are being deposited outside the nest. But as far as seed germination goes, it's not affecting germination. And then it hasn't really been measured as much here, but in Australia, there is, though, more work showing that for the seeds that are ending up around ant nests, they are actually, once they germinate, their seedlings are going to do better because they have that higher nutrient quality. So we can call this directed dispersal because the seeds are ending up in areas that are more beneficial to them than just ending up beside the parent plant or ending up randomly in the soil matrix. And this isn't the end of it. Another thing to consider is that mice and other rodents will also eat these seeds if given the opportunity. But if seeds are being taken down into the nest, and especially if the lysomes are being removed, the seeds are a lot harder to access and a lot less attractive once the lysomes are removed for mice and other rodents. And so ants are actually then providing this protection from predation for the seeds as well. And the last little thing to consider is also, along with that, removing the lysomes, protecting from predators, it can also help actually protect from pathogens. And so this is a little less studied, but ants are very clean creatures and they have different parts of their bodies that can actually secrete antimicrobial substances. So this diagram is just showing all the different parts where different ants can have different antimicrobial, essentially hand sanitizer secretions. And so they'll use that to, keep themselves clean, keep the colony clean, keep the nest clean, to just reduce the amount that their young might get sick or that their nest might get infected. But if they're also handling the seeds and any of the substances getting onto the seeds, that might also then be cleaning the seed and potentially cleaning the seed from things that would otherwise infect the seed. And so again, there isn't as much work on this, which is a shame because it could be really interesting, but there is this potential for it. So in some, Myrmecochory, although it has this general story of seeds being dispersed by ants and both sides benefiting, the actual hows and whys have a lot more variation. The lysomes do provide food, but whether or not that's better than any other food the ants might be consuming depends. And then what actually happens to the seeds, determined by what the ants are doing, also depends on the ant species, the particular nests they have at that time of year, and a whole range of other things. So big takeaway from this is that there are a lot of partners that could participate in Myrmecochory, but who your partner is going to affect your outcomes. And now that we've seen a little bit of how ant-mediated seed dispersal happens, I want to show you just a few common plants that you can find here at Letzinger as well as elsewhere in the area, maybe even your backyard. And along with that, then, if you maybe want to go see for yourself, ants actually carrying the seed somewhere, I have just a few tips, or maybe if you want to show a grandkid or a child, might also be things to keep in mind to prepare so that you can increase the odds that you'll actually see this happen. And so what we do whenever I've worked with these seeds, just to help ensure that I see whenever an ant is actually taking the seed, is I place the seeds on a white backdrop. And that just helps increase the contrast for me and my field assistants so that we can actually see what's going on. So if you have seeds that you can find and collect, it helps if you know your phenology of when plants are fruiting and when they're going to be ripe. But then you can actually place them on that white little piece of paper, put it on the ground, and watch it for a little while and see if the ants are going to come to it. Also, other things to keep in mind, ants do, their behavior varies a little bit with the day and with the weather. So kind of late morning, especially when it's not too hot, but when it is warm enough that it's nice to be out, that's when you're going to see a lot of activity as well as more. There'll be a little tapering off of activity in the late afternoon when it's a little bit too hot, more in the summer. But in the spring, it might not be as much of an issue. And also if you then potentially, if you have seeds in your, bloodroot fruits in your yard that you want to hold on to for when, you can show somebody, or just when you have the time to sit down and watch this. A lot of these plants don't store very well in the seed form. They need a lot of moisture. So putting a little paper towel in a plastic bag with them and keeping them refrigerated, not freezing them, that'll kill them. But that can just help preserve them for a little while. And so, again, I just want to emphasize also that seed dispersal by ants happens in a lot of different areas, but we have the privilege of being in an area where we have an exceptional diversity of ant dispersed plants. And most of them are spring blooming flowers. So this is from last week in Illinois. And I just want to show it because you can see this blanket of white flowers. And if you actually start to look in at what plants are composing this blanket of flowers, we have Dutchman's breeches, those are ant dispersed. We have spring beauty, that's ant dispersed. Sometimes you'll have some false mellow rule that can be ant dispersed as well. Looking at some other plants in that same area that were also blooming last weekend, squirrel corn, trillium, all ant dispersed, and all blooming around this time of year. So it's kind of the moment to see these plants in bloom. And these are photos from Letzinger from earlier this week. You all have a couple different trilliums around that you could go and see in bloom too. And then pretty soon they'll start developing fruits. These ones are for ones just off to the northeast of the prairie and heading towards the cabin area or past the cabin area for the green trillium. And so again, they're all kind of in bloom right now. This is this flush of ant dispersed plants blooming. Same thing with wood poppy, that's starting to bloom right now. It's going to be a little later for its peak bloom, but that is getting up there. And so I have photos of the Asarum for this. And so things that you might be noticing with all of these photos are that these plants, if you're familiar with them, or even just looking at the context, they're not very big. And you can tend to find them in clumps. And so part of this is that a lot of them do spread vegetatively through their rhizomes. And so that's part of how they are getting distance. But then a lot of them, all the ones I'm showing also are ant dispersed. And so ants are playing a role in this spread as well. Here's that Dutchman's breeches closer up as well. Letzinger doesn't have a big population of this. From my visit with Adam, it looks like the deer are getting to it. But you might see it in other areas too. And then other common plants that I don't have on the map because you see a bunch of them and there are a bunch of different species can also be ant dispersed. Your sedges and your violets are big ones within that. An interesting thing with the violets and a couple other ant dispersed plants is that in addition to having glycosomes on the seeds, you can see here this capsule is open. And so they actually have more of a ballistic dispersal. And so there'll be a little explosion of the fruit opening. And that's going to send the seeds flying first. So that's actually then giving the plant a little bit extra distance. And then the fact that we're also seeing that ant dispersal adaptation on it means that there's an additional benefit that has been contributing to this dispersal as well, potentially. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of what plants to be looking for and to be keeping an eye on as they start fruiting. And even if you don't want to sit and watch what ants are coming, if you even just get down and look at them for a little bit, once the fruits start opening, you might see ants around and going towards the fruits themselves. And so something else you might have noticed about all these plants is that they tend to be in pretty mesic, wet-ish woodlands. But they also have a lot of overlap with slightly drier woodland areas as well. And so this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more about my own research and this last factor, fire. And so fire definitely does occur naturally and as a management tool. You've seen it at Letzinger and other places here in Missouri. it can happen in the areas where your ant-dispersed plants are growing. But despite that, there isn't really any work. There's one master's student in Florida that I know of that's also looking at this issue, but nobody's looked at what this presence of fire on the landscape might be doing to ant-mediated seed dispersal. And so that's where my dissertation is focusing. I'm looking at the role of prescribed burning on ant-mediated seed dispersal. And although this hasn't really been looked at in our area or anywhere else in Northeast America, in some of these other hotspots of Myrmecochory, the Mediterranean, South Africa, Australia, fire is also a part of landscape ecology and management. And there is more work on what it's doing, how it's interacting with ant-mediated seed dispersal. So I want to just show you one example in particular. In Australia, where you have a lot of savanna areas and that burn fairly frequently, and that are cases where you have a lot of ant-dispersed plants as well. And so some of these studies looking at the effect of fire on ant-mediated seed dispersal in Australia have shown a lot of benefits of fire, actually. In burned areas, they're seeing ants moving the seeds more often, quicker, farther distances. And part of that seems to be because there are just more of the ants that disperse the seeds, like this here. But there also seems to be an effect of the actual what fire is doing to the landscape. And so you think of an unburned area that probably has leaf flutter, different grasses in the way, other things that are making the soil surface uneven from the perspective of an ant. You know, a few leaves stacked up suddenly become a mountain when you're a tiny little ant. But once fire comes through, fire clears a lot of that out and flattens the surface and makes it a lot smoother going for ants or anything else that's wandering across the soil surface. And so that seems to also be part of why we're seeing more seed dispersal and it's going farther. And then that doesn't tell us what's happening to the plants, but we know that these seeds that are dispersed by these ants do better once they germinate. They have better nutrient loads at the nests, and just germination itself is easier and happens more often at nests compared to other parts of the landscape. So if fire is increasing ant dispersal and the number of seeds that are making it to ant nests, it's also then therefore benefiting the seeds because the seeds benefit from being at the ant nests. And so that's what happens in Australia in burned areas. We do know a little bit about what happens to fire in the Ozark region and the ant community. So Robin Verbal out at Missouri S&T has looked at the responses of the ant community to fire. And she found a pretty short-term, like a couple of months, effect on the species richness, the number of species of ants, and just total abundance of ants in burned areas, with the black here being the burned areas, the white being unburned. And so for the first couple months after a fire, she did find a difference, and there were fewer ants and fewer ant species after a fire. But after a few months, that difference had kind of become gone, had disappeared. So the community recovered fairly quickly. And so that's one component of what might be affecting then seed dispersing ants. I have a little bit of data on ant species, and a lot of it is still being analyzed right now. But what I am seeing is that the ants that are having the biggest responses to fire are those tiny little ants that didn't actually disperse the seeds very much, versus the seed dispersing ants don't seem to be as affected by fire. But that's still preliminary data. What I do have information though is from last summer where I was working at Shaw. We had a couple areas that were not burned, and then a couple areas that had been burned before the pandemic set in. And at 78 plots across these 4 sites, I set up 3 cards and put 20 seeds on each of these cards and then watched those for 20 hours, for 2 hours each. And noted what happened to the seeds. And so this was done with the help of 2 field assistants, Marcus and Greg, as well. And we found a couple really interesting results. So this is just the number of seeds that were taken. And again, the total seeds available were 20. And so in these burned areas, we see a lot more seeds being taken in general. And also often all of the seeds available were taken, compared to these unburned areas where we're not even having all seeds available being taken. So the number of seeds being taken in 2 hours is definitely higher in our burned areas. This is a significant difference. And then if you look at dispersal distance, so again, this is in meters, and the burned area is up here on the top. And so you can already see that there are just more seeds being taken in the burned area, and more of them are being taken slightly farther. Again, this is still, they're being taken a little over 2 feet compared to about 1.5 feet for the unburned areas. But that still, again, is almost doubling the dispersal distance that a lot of your seeds are then traveling. And more of them are also then making it out to farther distances as well. So similar to what was happening in Australia, we're seeing that these burned areas were having more seed dispersal by ants, and the seeds themselves are traveling farther, which could then benefit the seeds and the seedlings once they germinate. And I also do have information on the ants themselves and which species were doing this. And I just want to point out that although I'm not done identifying all these ants, I have the help of another Litzinger volunteer that some of you might know. This is Ari Zakharoff. You can't actually see his face in this photo, but he has a lot of my samples right now in a scope at his home that he's working through and helping me with. So yet another benefit of Litzinger, meet other cool people who are interested in the things you're interested in. And so the main takeaway from this is just that preliminary data on the effects of fire on Myrmecochory are showing that we are seeing more of it, and the seeds are traveling farther, at least in this area. I do have plans for field research this summer that will do this at a little larger scale, replicate it more at Tyson Research Center. And so hopefully we'll see even more of what's going on here. And so with that, I think the main takeaways here are that we've seen that partner identity matters in the outcomes for Myrmecochory. So what species are involved is going to affect the outcomes. And then hopefully you can think of a few now ant dispersed seeds that you might be able to see or point out to other people. And also you have learned a little bit of what fire might be doing to these seeds as well. So with that, I want to thank so many people who have helped me, my funding sources as well. And I'd like to open it up for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Eva. That was really great. And while you're waiting on some questions to come your way, I got an immediate question. What got you into ants and dispersing of plants, or were you first interested in plants and then kind of found ants and their dispersal mechanisms very interesting? How did you get your way into this?
Great question. And kind of a funny story, because I used to have the only creature in this world I disliked were ants, up until I came to UMSL, and I knew I was interested in seed dispersal. I'd been looking at other small animal mediated seed dispersal, like what snails or slugs might be doing. And we came across a paper on ants, and we started talking about it, and they're like, oh, we could do something like this pretty easily. And somehow that went from just talking about one paper to becoming my entire dissertation and discovering that ants are actually amazing.
That's fantastic.
So we did get a couple questions in the chat. From Ellen, what park in Illinois were you at where you saw all the Dutchman's breeches and other things?
That was Fern Cliff State Park. And so they have one particular hike. Gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's around this big kind of little plateau. And so you just walk around it, and basically the entire time we were seeing Dutchman's breeches and all these other beautiful wildflowers. Also, Shaw Nature Reserve has a lot, particularly around the area by the Trail House Woods. So you can see a lot right now too. And those are actually, they burned that area recently. So it's actually really open and pretty good visibility to see those as well.
And like you mentioned, we do have a lot of these species here on site. Except for Dutchman's breeches, we have like one small clump of those by the cabin, which the deer seem to really like nibbling on. I think last I looked, there's maybe 1 or 2 flowers left, but they might be gone now. Are bluebells ant-dispersed?
So this is something that I think, yes. Sorry, I was having muting issues with other things. So yes, there's another species of bluebell that occurs in Colorado, and we know that one's ant-dispersed. And so the bluebells that occur around here, I actually haven't observed the seeds, and this is one where it's a little ambiguous in the literature as to whether they're ant-dispersed. So it could be, though, if you go and look at it. I think there's a good chance that it could be.
And Marilyn asks, are the species you mentioned only dispersed by ants, or do other insects help as well?
So ants are the ones that we know do the vast majority of the dispersal. Other things will also take the seeds. So this is actually a spider that in one of my plots ended up stealing a seed from an ant and carrying it along with it. And so that could be providing some dispersal as well if it drops it. Wasps and slugs have also been shown to disperse seeds, but slugs tend to also just kill the seeds. So we're doing less of a dispersal unless they like drop it and forget about it. But other animals do account for a small percentage of dispersal for these seeds.
Lynn Good asked if you could talk a little bit more about ant-dispersal of spring beauties.
Yeah, so just like some of these other plants, spring beauty does have then elaiosomes on it. And I believe spring beauty is also ballistically dispersed like viola. So it's a thing where the ant is actually providing the second phase of dispersal. And so first the seed is being flung out, and then because it has the elaisome, the ants can still find it and carry it even farther and carry it and provide these additional benefits.
I think this question is also from Lynn. When was seed dispersal by ants first studied, and when did it take off? When did it become a hot topic?
Yeah, so there are accounts and mentions of it starting in the 60s, maybe even a little bit before then. But where it really started taking off as a topic was in the 70s and 80s. There are a couple of researchers, some of them based in Northern America, a little bit closer to the East Coast, and then also a big contingent of people in Australia. And so a lot of the early work on seed dispersal by ants is on what's happening here with the native flora in North America and in South Africa and Australia, kind of the big trio. And then since then, it's there are a lot of people working on it now, but also because it's occurring in so many different places. Brazil is also actually a big area where it happens, not just with seeds with elaiosomes, but also like fruits that still have bits of fruit on them after like a bird or a mammal has dispersed it. The ants will actually pick those up and also carry them. So it's not the same like direct adaptation for the ant dispersal with an elaisome, but it still is having a lot of the same effects.
Okay, and question from Diane. She said, video of the ant carrying the seed was amazing. And do they only eat the elaisome? And how do they get it apart from the seed?
So it's actually really easy to remove the elaisome. Like if you handle the seed too brusquely, you can sometimes rip bits of it off. And so for an ant with mandibles, it's really easy to kind of just clip it off. One thing that is another aspect of this variation is that different ants are better or worse at just like cleanly cutting the elaisome off versus just like kind of ripping bits of it and leaving bits of it still on. And then so there are cases in which the ants will also eat the seed itself. Some of your more predatory ants will do that. And once you start traveling southwest into where you get more of the desert seed harvesting ants, although they can also do seed dispersal, they will also actually eat and kill the seeds too.
So, question for me, I guess. So like our ideal like prescribed burn window is usually in the non-growing season. So we try to burn from like November until February at the latest. Outside of that, you can have like, there's been studies showing it can negatively affect the plant and wildlife communities. So can you just talk a little bit about how timing of prescribed burns affects ant seed dispersal and what you've found in your field study?
Yeah. And so the burns that I was looking at last year were dormant season burns. And I will actually be looking at burns that occurred the 1st and 2nd of this month at Tyson this year. So things were already starting to emerge. So I'm really curious to see how that's going to be different this year. In terms of what we know, how this is affected in other ways, ants themselves are pretty good at surviving burns, in part because they have pretty high thermal tolerances. And if you're buffered by the soil above you or even the tree around you, the temperatures that you're actually experiencing are going to be a lot less than what it would be if you were on the surface. That surface of the fire temperature could actually be the biggest thing for the plants if they are starting to emerge, because that would kill them in most cases. And so this is where one of the other cases in which the seed dispersal and potential interaction with fire in our area could differ from what's going on in Australia and South Africa and these more arid areas. Because in those arid areas, those plants we know are actually adapted for that high intensity burn that they're going to be experiencing. So some of those seeds actually won't germinate if they don't get a high temperature that you would get from a fire. In other cases, they won't even release seeds until they've been burned. And so we see a much more tighter, basically adaptation of the plants to fire in these areas that are drier, compared to what we were seeing for the spring flora here. Again, because a lot of what we have for ant dispersed plants here are a little more moist, mesic loving. And so this is another area of interest for me, and to see if this may actually have detrimental effects then on the plants compared to some of these other regions.
So we are just beginning to reincorporate fire into our woodlands. We burned a section of the Northwoods for the first time in ever last burn season. Hopefully we'll be burning some of the Southwoods this year. So hopefully we'll see a corresponding boost to our ant-dispersed spring ephemerals. Lynn Good asks, do you know of any flower or crop farmers taking advantage of seed dispersal by ants?
Flower or crop farmers taking advantage of this? To my knowledge, no, with the exception that, so there are a few select plant nurseries that specialize in essentially native plants, like Prairie Moon Nursery. And so I had reached out to them as potential seed sources. And a lot of their setup is actually they just have woodland areas or tree covered areas where they have their different plants that they're growing to sell. And so they're not directly harvesting the ants, but since they're kind of just letting things happen a little more wildly, in that sense, they're benefiting from it, but it's not, most of our commercial crops in our area are not, I mean, none of our commercial crops in our area are ant dispersed.
So there's no captive ant farms that people are using to yield seed?
To the extent of my knowledge, no. I think that'd be great. I do have an ant colony that maybe I should start putting seeds into my tank. So.
Susan Barron from Listening Road Ecology Center asks, do you think the increase in seed dispersal after a burn is the result of a lack of other food or easier travel or something else?
I think it is probably a little bit of both. And so again, there is more just consideration of it just being easier to travel in. And so one of the other things I'm doing is taking pitfall samples at my traps that will show, at my plots, that will show what other invertebrates are available in the area, which is going to then give a proxy for what food is available. And so that could definitely be part of what's going on as well, but there's not a whole lot of evidence right now for the exact mechanism.
I think that's all the questions in our chat. Oh, no, the incognito guy in the basement. Similar to which came first, the chicken or the egg, with a co-evolutionary twist, which came first, the ant or the plant?
Most evidence supports the ant. And so where lysomes are coming from, again, this has evolved different times, but it's generally some like part of another coating that the seed already was developing, or something that the seed would have had, and that because ants are already tuned into this kind of chemical signature, like essentially what a seed smells like to an ant is what a dead insect smells like to an ant. And so they're already searching for that dead insect and don't really seem to care that it's actually a seed and not a dead insect because they're still getting food from it. And so based on that, and also just based on what we know about evolutionary history of ants versus plants, it's an ant was already doing this thing and the plants just developed something that took advantage of it, essentially.
Okay, are there any more questions, comments?
I got one more if nobody else has got questions.
Now this guy.
So along with this, all of our, at least all the plants I can think of that are ant dispersed seem like they're spring ephemerals. Do you know of any native plants that are non-spring ephemerals?
It does depend on how you define an ephemeral. And so like wild ginger is actually fruiting a little bit later and holding on to its leaves well into the growing season, whereas like Dutchman's beeches is just gone in a few weeks. And so whether you consider something ephemeral, if it still is holding onto its leaves and developing long after its seeds have been dispersed, is part of it. But that being said, what we are seeing in our area is definitely spring blooming flowers in general. Some like rushes and violets will also bloom more into the summer. But still, and part of that is just that's when you're having ants being most active as well.
Yeah, and kind of like what you said too, I would think this time of year there's going to be a lot less food options for them, and so it makes sense for the plants to have evolved this, advantage here in the springtime versus later in the year when the ants might not be really searching for such a food if it's not providing a lot of benefits.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've got a question.
Mm-hmm.
If we take our index cards outside with seeds with the lyosomes, how long does it take for ants to show up?
Ooh, yeah.
It's going to depend on where you are and what ant colonies you have. So if you want to increase the chances of it, if you find someplace that looks really anty, like a dead log is a good bet. Just because that's going to increase the chance that they're probably going to be ants nesting in there. And if they are, they'll probably find the seeds more quickly because they're close by. What I've also done in the past is actually located nests first. And so if you put like pecan sandies are the classic because they are kind of doing that same like fats, sugars, proteins, everything all at once. I just put a pecan sandy on the ground and then ants will come to that and you can follow them back to their nests because they have this big chunk of pale cookie in there. And then you find the nest entrance and then you can put your note card with seeds right there. And they'll find it a lot quicker.
Now they just need to make GPS units so small that you can glue a little piece of a lysome on a GPS unit so that you can really track them.
That's what I'm waiting for.
Or like mini GoPros you can attach to ants.
Oh man, that would really be the dream.
One more question in the chat. What do ants eat the rest of the year other than dropped cookies?
So dead insects do make up a big portion of the prey. This also, it depends on the ant species. And so for the ones that are dispersing seeds in particular, they are ones that are more omnivorous or even carnivorous. Other ants will eat more like sugars that are coming off of aphids or plant nectar. Some of the omnivores will also eat those things. Ants will eat fungus, different fungus. Some will cultivate it, some just in our area, not that many cultivate it, but some will still harvest it from just what's already out there growing. But yeah, a lot of the seed dispersing ones have a very wide diet range in our area.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thank you so much, Eva, for taking time to share your research with us. Very interesting. As she mentioned, a lot of these plants are blooming right now at Litzinger. So if you haven't signed up for an LREC tour recently, do it. Come out, bring your index cards. I guess not now, they'll wait a little bit for the index cards, but yeah, I know the bloodroots have just finished. They're actually already starting to fruit. The celandine poppies, the trilliums, claytonias, they're all hitting peak bloom right now. So yeah.
Thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you everybody for tuning in. Our next enrichment is sometime in May. Do we know the exact date?
I think we have April 22nd.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But that
It's a more unique enrichment. It's Liz Hasselmuller's lab from St. Louis University. All the students will be presenting short little chunks of research from their lab's research here on site. So make sure you guys sign up for that one.
That's all creek monitoring stuff, right, James?
Yeah, that's all Deer Creek monitoring information, water quality. You weren't supposed to say my name, Susan. I'm incognito.
Sorry, Jason.
Oh, there you go.
Smooth.
Well, again, Eva, like you got lots of thanks in the chat. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Well,
Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy well, it's not super nice spring weather today, but eventually it'll warm up again. So go outside, look around for some flowers and ants near you.
and Eva offered Carex to do a video with us.
I do. Yes, I would love to do that. And I'm very happy to.
So look forward to
Look
all
forward
that.
to
All right. See you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Take care.